the women of London now feared to walk the streets alone, wary of the creep lurking in the shadows and attacking from behind, a perverse man with violent tendencies that targeted vulnerable ladies, getting a sick satisfaction from the pain he inflicted with his blade. This probably sounds familiar, but this is not the tale of Jack the Ripper, the infamous killer who brutally murdered and mutilated women in the Whitechapel district of London. No, exactly a century before the Ripper, the monster hunted in the streets, stalking women and unleashing his wave of disturbing crime. An attack may go like this: a fashionable young lady on her way home, unaware of the prowling predator who is now approaching. The man yells violent threats and vulgar obscenities towards her, using grotesque language unlike she had ever heard. As he begins to act more and more aggressive, he closes in on the isolated woman, revealing the blade in his hand. He grabs her and slashes her across the ass. Yeah, this guy was pretty fucking weird, man. But this was his MO, to use his various bladed and pinned arsenal to slash, stab, and pierce a woman's backside, shredding cloth and flesh alike. He took joy in watching their anguish, then fleeing the scene before help could arrive and retreating back to his lair. While he shares many similarities with Jack the Ripper, the London monster is more of a Scooby-Doo villain when compared to his more sadistic successor. He was not a murderer, but while his crimes were absurd and almost cartoonish, they were still quite violent. These unusual attacks usually resulted in some significant injuries and some very, very frightened ladies, leading to both a mass panic and a manhunt for the deranged devil who the press would dub the Monster. But let's start from the beginning. The monster attacks first began in 1788, and it didn't take long for these stories to gain the attention of the wider public. It began with a few women reporting being stalked and harassed by a man described as short, thin, and with a big nose. The most consistent detail, though, the one that occurs in nearly every encounter, was how indecent the language he used was. It was especially noteworthy for the time, and consisted of vulgar and explicit remarks or advances. Sometimes that was as bad as it got, and he would either retreat or be forced away before things could escalate. Oftentimes, though, that was not the end of it, and the monster would return. He seemed to seek out a young lady, and would continue the hunt until satisfied, accosting her several times or even standing outside her house, especially if she got away. Many times when the monster was on the prowl, he would strike. After harassing his target, he would pull out a knife and then badly cut or stab the victim, usually on their hips or thighs. Often they didn't even know what had happened until after the fact. As the reports of encounters with this creep increased, so did the bloody nature of them, with the monster becoming increasingly violent and somewhat creative. What started as a handful of cases quickly turned into dozens that further illustrated his MO. The monster exclusively targeted women, especially young, wealthy, or at least well-off ones, with fancy and expensive dresses that he could shred and ruin. However, the clothing was not the target, but the skin underneath, as he stabbed the woman's backside with his little prick. To achieve this, he unleashed a strange arsenal of bladed and pointed weapons. In addition to his trusty small knife or large pen, some reports tell of blades attached to his knees so that he could violently knee women from behind. He may have also had an iron claw of sorts that was comprised of several sharp prongs. A sword stick or cane sword, that is a walking cane that contains a hidden blade. Perhaps most creatively, though, was his artificial bouquet that, you guessed it, contained another hidden blade. He would use this fake bunch of flowers to lure in an unsuspecting woman to smell, just to stab her in the face and laugh hysterically afterwards. Regarding the nature of the attacks, if you were to give the monster some benefit of the doubt, you may say he attacked the way he did, targeted a certain area of the body, because he didn't want to inflict lethal blows, like stabbing the stomach or back might yield. And since he usually attacked from behind, that left the backside area as the target. After all, he was not a murderer, at least that we know of. He was an ass stabber, guilty of harassment, assault, and being a goddamn weirdo. but not a killer. However, at least one woman did almost die as a result of an attack. There could be significant blood loss and infection, as these cuts could be very deep and long. He did also sometimes go after a girl's hair or breast, so it seems that he mainly just wanted to inflict pain. Maybe not death, but it's clear he got off by hurting these women and the humiliation it brought. The bizarre elements of the attacks can be better explained by a sexual perversion. The monster acting out his depraved desires, the piercing of a woman's skin, her cries and torment, satisfying some sadistic sexual fetish.
You're right, Scoob. We're dealing with one sick son of a bitch.
Some theorize he had some unresolved frustration or anger towards women, or even society in general. I don't know, man. Whatever the case was, it understandably shocked the people of London, and the tension in the city would only continue to grow over the subsequent months. The media dubbed the criminal the Monster, and he quickly became an infamous character in London, whose twisted legend became larger and more despicable every night. As more and more victims came forward, descriptions of the monster varied quite drastically. Sometimes he was tall, sometimes he was short, sometimes large, sometimes small, but he was always foul-mouthed and aggressive. If he could spare the time after the attack, he would like to calmly listen to his victims' anguished screams before slipping back to his monster den. In fact, he really wanted to look them in the face. He wanted to see the victims, and in some cases, it seems he wanted them to see him. He also apparently never wore any disguise or mask, aside from maybe some powder. You'd think this would make him pretty easy to catch, but he was unfortunately quite crafty as well. In the few times he was almost caught or confronted, he was always able to weasel his way out, oftentimes through sheer luck, but believe it or not, sometimes being able to be charismatic when accused. Now, since he would like to get literally right up in your face, and would usually harass a girl multiple times, it seems very likely that she would be able to recognize his face. However, given the inconsistent description of the man, it kind of points to two possibilities. One is that some of the women are either lying or just don't remember his appearance as well as they thought. To be fair, they would likely be a bit traumatized. However, another possibility, one that was suggested quite early on, is that there was more than one monster. Indeed, this seems pretty plausible. There is speculation that the monster was not a lone wolf, rather a pack of wolves that each hunted in a very similar manner, perhaps a group of friends that were rejects, without much luck with the ladies, now unleashing their creepy fury onto those that denied them. It's been suggested that the London Monster is a case that involves copycats. Usually in the case of a copycat, such as a killer, the reasoning is that they can commit crimes that will be blamed on the original perpetrator, or that they are inspired by their work. At this point in the story though, we have very little to go on. Now, believe it or not, there was some historical precedent for this style of crime. This was not the first time something like this had occurred in London. The situation was reminiscent of Whipping Tom, another deviant that operated in London over a century before the monster. He shares some uncanny resemblance to his eventual successor. Around 1681, a man who'd become known as Whipping Tom would wait in the shadows of central London's alleyways and courtyards. He too liked the fancier ladies, and when he would spot an unaccompanied one, he'd approach her from behind, grab her, bend her over his knee, lift up her dress, and then spank her. Sometimes with his bare hand, sometimes with a rod, but always quite brutally, leaving the poor lady injured. Whipping Tom then apparently would shout, "Spanko!" and vanish into thin air before help could arrive or the victim could see her attacker. He escaped so quickly that some likened him to having supernatural powers, seemingly evaporating into the night's wind, leaving only a battered and bruised woman in his wake. Whipping Tom's attacks were much more sudden and swiftly executed than the London Monsters, who liked to draw out every encounter and stick around to see the aftermath. However, just like we'll see with the monster, the people of London were not having Tom's shit. People were fed up with law enforcement being unable to catch this guy, so they began to take matters into their own hands. Women began to carry small knives, needles, or scissors in order to defend themselves, and men would even dress as women with the hopes of luring the unsuspecting miscreant out and turning the beatdown onto him. Now eventually 2 men would be arrested, a local haberdasher and his accomplice, although the details of this trial are unfortunately lost to time. so what punishment, if any, Whipping Tom and company faced is unknown. As for this Skipping Jane figure that you're seeing in the old illustration, that seems to have been an artistic choice to give Tom a partner, which makes more sense in the context of the original publication. So no, there wasn't a chick running around doing this, but a guys instead. Now, to make this strange tale even stranger is that there seems to have been multiple Whipping Toms over the years. London's kind of got a problem with this. In 1712, 30 years later, another deviant called Whipping Tom operated in Hackney, London, only about 6 miles from where the monster would later have his creepy spree. This Tom attacked in much the same manner as the previous, using a rod to savagely beat his victims, reportedly up to 70 in total, over a little less than a 2-month period. A man named Thomas Wallace was caught and explained his crimes as him being resolved to be revenged on all the women he could come at after that manner, for the sake of one perjured female who had been barbarously false to him. His goal was to attack 100 women before Christmas. Interestingly enough, there may have been another Whipping Tom before the original in 1681, this one being 9 years prior in 1672. But there really isn't a whole lot of information out there regarding these Whipping Toms. There may be some exaggerations going on, but it seems there is some truth to these accounts. So yeah, this isn't as isolated an example as you may have thought. There's always sick fricks out there. Stay safe. Now though, in the late 18th century, 100 years removed from Whipping Tom, it was the London monster that had women looking over their shoulders. These assaults were methodical. The monster was careful who and when he attacked, so that even in the bustling city of London, he safely avoided any repercussions, always being long gone before help could arrive. It was frustrating. People just wanted it to end so that they could get back to their lives without fear. For the sophisticated individuals of Georgian society, he was like a devil that sought to destroy their proper and refined lifestyles, a degenerate who lacked any gentlemanly qualities, instead living in sheer perversion. The clash between the two forces, a cultured and civilized class against a crude and crass deviant, was an extreme contrast, and perhaps that had something to do with the monster's disturbing behavior. But it also quickly led to him becoming notorious and public enemy number 1. Londoners were outraged and desperate to catch the monster, to put an end to his creepy ways. But this was something much easier said than done. The monster could pretty much be any man. Hell, there could be more than one. Just like with Whipping Tom, women would take measures to protect their bodies from harm, this time fashioning makeshift armor to shield their ass from the monster's weaponry. This could be accomplished in several ways. A fashionable, well-off lady may be fitted with a copper cuirass, or maybe just a copper pan placed over her petticoat. For the less well-off lasses, you'd have to be content with cork or a porridge pot. A copper bottom may help shield a lady's backside from the worst of the attacks, but they were not quite the solution to the overall problem. The menace still stalked the streets, and women's asses were still on the line. The monster needed to be caught, and he needed to be punished. Now, before the days of Scotland Yard or the Metropolitan Police, what passed for law enforcement at this time was the Bow Street Runners. This force was responsible for policing the area and conducting investigations into criminal matters. They were to be the ones looked upon to catch the monster, but this would prove a nearly impossible task. The Runners were a very primitive version of a modern police force. They had not nearly enough officers to cover such a massive and dense area, as well as far less resources than they needed. Bow Street relied on victims to come to them before they would look into a matter, and there was no shortage of these alleged victims enlisting the services of the Runners, but that was an issue in itself. With such little manpower and a long list of leads, many of which were a waste of time, trying to deal with a subsequently rising crime rate and trying to hunt down the monster at the same time was simply not feasible. There just wasn't enough to go on. Thanks to the numerous reported cases, most of the men in the city could now fit the broad and ever-changing description. So really, without catching the monster in the act or stumbling upon sufficient proof of his misdeeds, there really was not a whole lot that law enforcement could realistically do. For this to change, the monster would need to slip up, or someone would need to discover new hard evidence. They needed to get lucky. What was a hopeful way to turn the odds in their favor, but instead only exacerbated the issue once more, was when wealthy businessman John Angerstein promised a handsome reward for whoever captured the monster. This was a sizable reward of £100, equivalent to like 19,000 today. Now it wasn't only about ending this deranged spree once and for all, but now a financial opportunity to line one's pockets as well. While his intentions may have been good, Angerstein's proposal only led to more false allegations and the Bow Street runners being bombarded with more unsubstantiated claims. The dire situation was now more dire, and would only get worse. To put it bluntly, it was all a shit show. Like with Whipping Tom, the people of London's patience was worn thin, and they did not simply wait for the monster to make a mistake or move on to another city, especially now that a fat stack of cash had entered the picture. So instead, they took matters into their own hands. And unsurprisingly, this desperate hunt led to no miracle capture, but instead collateral damage, and pretty much just made everything worse. Ironically, men became indirect victims of the monster as well, as mere accusations could lead to savage beatings and public smearings of innocent men. This mob justice allowed other petty criminals to thrive as well, who could take advantage of the vigilante beatdowns or arrests to commit crimes like theft or even an excuse to get a couple licks in on a hated rival, with valuable items and any human decency lost in the anonymity of the commotion. Just the mere accusation of being suspicious was a real threat to a man who didn't have the best standing in society. Poorer men may be forced to stay in jail for days until their name was cleared, unable to work and provide for their families. Just like how women tried to protect themselves with pans over their petticoats, men began to wear badges pinned to them that read "No Monster" in order to spare their own suffering at the mob's hands. This No Monster Club, who cleared themselves of wrongdoing, now roamed the streets with other gangs with the mission to capture the real monster. But while women's pans and men's pens may lessen their risks of an attack, and with vigilantes on the prowl in a citywide manhunt, it would all do little to quell the hysteria. The monster was still out there, his misdeeds published in graphic detail in the papers, his caricature showing his fiendish face. It was like he was taunting the people of London. The fear and anger the monster brought upon the city had caused a snowball effect that led to many Londoners feeling unsafe just stepping outside their homes and going about their daily lives. There was something of a mass panic, and things were only becoming more unstable and more violent. As gangs of monster hunters patrolled the city looking for any possible suspect, this monster hysteria that plagued the streets of London would only continue to worsen, permeating like a dark fog of mistrust that engulfed the city, until they got him. Well, maybe. One notable difference between the monster and the Ripper is that someone was actually convicted of the former's crimes. But it's of course not quite that simple, as like with the rest of this tale, the trial would also be an odd ordeal and have its share of controversy. On one fine day in 1790, around 2 years after the first attacks, a woman named Anne Porter was walking in the park with her suitor, a gentleman and fishmonger named John Coleman. They were accompanied by Porter's sisters and mother, and Coleman's brother. While they were enjoying the fresh summer air, Porter noticed someone walk by and look at her. A man, a myth, a monster. You see, a few months prior, Anne Porter and her sister Sarah Porter were victims of the monster. One night, they had gone to a ball at the palace, as the Queen's birthday was being celebrated. Knowing the dangers of walking home alone at night, they had arranged for their father and a friend to come to the palace at the ball's conclusion and accompany them home afterwards. However, the dances had ended early, and not wanting to stick around and wait for the men to come take them home, they opted to go ahead and leave of their own accord, as they did not live far, just about a 10-minute walk away. This decision, though, is one they would come to regret. While they were nearing their father's home where they resided, Sarah suddenly told Anne to run as fast as she could. Sarah made it up the steps of the house unharmed, but Anne was not so lucky. For as she had made her way up the stairs, she felt something at the hip of her dress. The monster had just barely got her. Anne was otherwise able to make it into the safety of the home. However, upon turning and looking down the steps, she saw the monster waiting there, wanting to look upon her frightened face. However, in doing so, she was able to look upon his face as well. Now, several months later, she was looking at that very same face, and Anne Porter quickly informed her lover, John Coleman, that the infamous ass stabber was right before them. Coleman then began a gentlemanly pursuit of the accused, and this pursuit was very strange. Coleman followed the man for several blocks, through several buildings, all while yelling insults at him and trying to get him to stop, just as the monster had done to countless young ladies. But it was to no avail, as the man said nothing and continued to walk until entering a house. To Coleman, it was clear the man was avoiding him, instead of confronting him, which made him suspicious. Now, despite his aggressive pursuit, John Coleman had no plans to just beat the shit out of him, and instead a kind of weird interaction would go down. The owner of the residence permitted Coleman to come in and speak with the man he was pursuing, who was now sitting in the dark. Coleman apologized for his rude behavior, unbecoming of a gentleman, and explained his situation. The two would have a pleasant conversation and agree to exchange addresses. However, when a candle was brought in so that they could see to write, they were now able to see the other, and they realized that they actually knew each other. The man in question was Renwick Williams, a 28-year-old Welshman who worked as a florist. John Coleman did not believe the man before him to be the infamous monster, and left in peace. After going on his way though, Coleman did have his regrets. He regretted treating Williams so impolitely and behaving with such bad manners as he pursued him. However, he also regretted simply letting the man go, as if the Porter sisters were right, he was just face to face with the London monster, and such a fiend would have no issue giving Coleman a fake address. As fate would have it though, as both were walking home that night, they came across each other once again. This time Coleman would convince a reluctant Williams to accompany him to the Porter residence, where upon entering, the Porter sisters fainted at the mere sight of him. This would in many ways seal the fate of Renwick Williams. From here, the accused man would wind up in Bow Street, and from there, the Old Bailey, as a suspect who would soon stand trial. For around 2 years, the monster had preyed upon the young ladies of London, and now finally, it seemed there was hope it could all end with the perpetrator of those dastardly deeds facing justice. However, first Williams would need to stand trial. While he had yet to be found guilty in the court of law, he had already been given the death sentence by the court of public opinion. Throughout the proceedings, attendees would yell and shout, disrupting the session, eager to see Williams found guilty and given a harsh punishment. There was one issue though. What Williams was accused of was not that big of a crime. Assault, even with intent to kill, was only a misdemeanor, and therefore even if found guilty, he would not face a long sentence. The people and the court believed that the notorious London monster could not get off that easily. There was an old statute, however, that defined assault with the intent to tear or deface clothing as a felony. This could technically fit, and would see Williams facing more prison time. So yes, the monster was essentially charged with slashing the clothes of Anne Porter. The court proceedings were something of a mess. The main witnesses were the Porter sisters, including Anne and Sarah. Not only did they swear as to seeing Williams attack them that night, but he had apparently been stalking them for quite a while. Several times before the attack, the Wretch, as the sisters had come to call him, had aggressively pursued them, walking behind them, leaning over their shoulders and saying very indecent and disgusting things to them. On the night of the vicious attack on Anne's dress, he had been standing in the street, and when he saw the ladies walking by, he hit Sarah in the back of the head, prompting her to tell Anne to run as they tried to make their escape into their house. However, there were also those that came to the defense of Williams, perhaps the most notable being his boss. His boss testified that on the night of the infamous Porter attack, which was on the Queen's birthday, Williams had in fact been with him at the workshop, working late into the night to complete an order. His co-workers, many of whom were women, corroborated this as they had also been there, and everyone that had worked with him described his character as that of a good-natured young man. The work done at this shop by Williams may be somewhat suspicious though. He specialized in artificial flowers, which brings to mind the monster's fake bouquet of flowers, with a hidden sharp object concealed within. However, this is just more circumstantial evidence in the end. As for physical evidence, there wasn't any. There was the slashed dress and the large wound on Anne Porter's thigh, but that hardly proves any guilt on Williams's part. His lodgings had been searched, but no bladed instruments or suspicious property had been discovered. Furthermore, while some women identified Williams as their attacker, many women did not, swearing he was not the man. This case essentially boiled down to one question: do you believe the testimony of the 4 Porter sisters or that of the workshop's employees? Well, for the jury, it was easy. They quickly found Renwick Williams guilty of assault with intent to deface clothing. The trial had turned into something of a sham, and the judge was ultimately not satisfied with it, so Williams would be granted a retrial under the original charges. His new lawyer was much more aggressive in his defense of the suspect. He called into question Ann Porter's and John Coleman's motives for accusing Williams. Angerstein's reward money had, after all, led to many false allegations against innocent men, so it could make sense that Porter and Coleman were in it for the reward. Upon hearing of the case against Williams, Angerstein had contacted both Porter and Coleman about the money they were entitled to, £50 each. However, Ann Porter and Angerstein testified that she had never collected her money, saying she wanted nothing to do with it. John Coleman, though, it seems, did collect his. It should also be noted that soon after the trial, Porter and Coleman would get married. In this second trial, though, very little would change, as the jury would once again find Renwick Williams guilty, this time on 3 counts of assault, 1 for Ann Porter and 2 more for 2 other women, which also mainly had just witness testimony to go on. There were more indictments against Williams, including that of Sarah Porter, but the family and court elected not to prosecute him further. Williams was ordered to serve 2 years for each count, a total of 6 years in Newgate Prison in London. It does seem that while Williams was imprisoned, the monster attacks suspiciously stopped. This may very well be more proof against him, showing that they did indeed get the right man. Or it may just be that the real monster used an innocent man's conviction as a means to escape his own retribution. Or it may instead point to the mass hysteria coming to an end, the over-exaggerated terror that existed more in the minds of Londoners than in the physical streets of London. In this theory, Williams was a scapegoat, a sacrifice that all the blame could be pinned on, so the city could then wash their hands of the situation. After serving his sentence at Newgate Prison, Renwick Williams, as bitter as he had become during this ordeal, tried his best to live out his days in peace and obscurity. It seems he may have changed his name to Henry, stayed in London, continued his work as an artificial flower maker, fathered a son, and likely died in 1831, living a mostly normal life post-release. Following the trial, the people of London had forgotten all about Renwick Williams, and would quickly resume their lives as the whole Monster Mania debacle soon became little more than a footnote of the era. As the years turned to decades, and then to centuries, many have questioned whether or not Williams was truly the London Monster. While there was some circumstantial evidence against him, there was nothing truly damning. There was no smoking gun that linked him to the attacks. He was never caught in the act, never admitted any guilt, nor was concrete proof of his involvement ever discovered. Some do question the Porter sisters and Coleman's motives, and the many conflicting accounts of the victims. There is also the idea that many of the women lied about or exaggerated their attacks. They point to the idea that since the monster usually targeted young, pretty, wealthy women, it meant that being a victim of the monster came with some prestige. If you weren't targeted, it was almost an insult. It's perhaps likely that this did occur to some extent, with there being 50+ accusers, but that doesn't mean there weren't legitimate accounts as well. While someone may be willing to cut up their dress for the ruse, they're much less likely to actually cut into their flesh as well, something that in the monster cases often required medical treatment from a doctor. In the modern day, we find ourselves looking back on this curious case with a healthy dose of skepticism. It's clear that the story of the London Monster is one that was, at least to some extent, sensationalized, making discerning truth from myth nearly impossible. How many women were actually attacked by the monster? Was more than one man the monster? Did the monster exist at all? These are questions that researchers have asked for over 2 centuries. As for Renwick Williams, he was found guilty and thus forever labeled as the monster. Yet there are many reasons to question that ruling. Regardless of whether you believe Williams was the attacker or not, there just wasn't evidence to convict him. The only evidence against him was circumstantial, witness testimony, and a suspicious job as a florist. However, victims also denied him being the monster, and his occupation and his co-workers provided him an alibi. So who is to be believed? Exactly 100 years later, Jack the Ripper would seek out and murder prostitutes in Whitechapel, London. Despite many devoted lifetimes spent investigating, there are still hundreds of men that could be the Ripper, and it's not guaranteed there was only one murderer. While his crimes were much more violent and the mystery of his identity much more well known, there are a lot of similarities between the two cases of the Ripper and the monster. There's the obvious ones like both men having a hatred for women and exclusively targeting them, but there are also underlying similarities that make the details of the cases murky. Unreliable witness testimony and inconsistent descriptions of the attacker, a lack of physical evidence, a press that capitalized on the situation, people seeking their brief moment in the spotlight, and a story that became sensationalized. Like the Ripper, the monster exists in myth as much as he does in reality, as there is very little to verify his existence. There are those that believe the entire thing is a fabrication, brought on by mass hysteria. Personally, I find it doubtful that every single person involved lied about the monster attacks. But the question becomes, how many monsters were there? Was this the work of one deranged man or multiple? With cases like this, I would wager the truth is likely somewhere in the middle. While he may or may not have had 50 victims as is reported, and while he may or may not be Renwick Williams, it seems evident that there was some deranged deviant with a dangerous disdain for females that roamed the cobbled streets of London.